Hi everyone, greetings. My name is V Tran and I'm an undergraduate at George Mason Forensic Science program. I am honored to introduce the following speaker. James Emerson is a member of the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence. He has been the chairman of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Computer Crime and Digital Evidence Committee for over 11 years. He's also a member of the IACP Law Enforcement Information and Technology Section Boards of Officers. He has more than 44 years of law enforcement and security experience with a 19-year focus on cybercrime investigation, computer forensics, and related criminal intelligence. Mr. Emerson has presented both evidence and expert testimony related to digital evidence in U.S. federal court and also trained law enforcement executives, criminal investigators, and prosecutors regarding digital evidence and forensics. Also, if you have any questions, we'll be handing out the mics.
Okay. No, thanks. So I'm the guy. I'm the guy standing between you and dinner and relaxation, maybe a couple of libations, something interesting. Given the instruction and the presentations we've seen, copy my email at the end. We also have for digital evidence, multimedia digital evidence, prosecutorial prep guides and those types of resources at the National White Collar Crime Center, where my current income rise. So I'm from New Jersey, and I got up at 5:30 to drive here this morning. And as I get into the presentation, if I start to speak a little quickly, that may just be cultural. But if you want me to go back and go through anything, please don't hesitate to push me backward, and we'll go through it. Here's my intended agenda this afternoon, and it's not as painful as it looks, but we will you just briefly kind of look at the evolution of digital evidence, what's happening right now. There's a number of topics that are fairly emergent, and so we'll take it in the context of what we see publicly also. Propagation is something that we spend a lot of time at NW3C talking to investigators and prosecutors about, because as we start to get further and further under the hood of digital technology, we start to understand exactly what's really there that we didn't know was there. And so I'll talk a little bit about that because some of that's relatively important from a prosecutorial or investigative standpoint. Medical death investigation, obviously, I really thought that I'd be talking to a lot more coroners and medical examiners today. So I want to put this in the context of medical death investigations. That's not to exclude the investigators. That's my fault in the way that I prepared to talk to the audience, but I'm going to make it relevant as we go through. And then I want to talk at the end a little bit about the need for focused research and standards. There's been a lot of talk about standards today and quality management, and this is a scientific area which deserves a lot of attention in that regard, as we're kind of moving into the reality that we're confronted with here. So I cherry picked some cases, but they'll illustrate my point. So I came up with a thesis, and then I found the evidence that not good evidence, just I found the evidence to make my point. So you'll see what I'm getting at here. So in 2002, Scott Peterson is accused of murdering Laci Peterson. He was convicted, as you'll recall. Computer forensics in that case and cell records, specifically global positioning data, was pertinent. It was critical to his conviction. In 2004, the BTK killer. Some of you may have heard of that case. Well, in that particular case, this individual who fancied himself really intelligent made a huge mistake with regard to storage media that he sent to authorities, and didn't understand fully the metadata associated with the storage media that he sent to those authorities, and that was critical in that case. Metadata being data about data. I'm going to talk more about that term, and so it may not be in one of the formal expert testimony guides in the sense that I express it, but we'll come back to that. So 2006, Matt and Carrie Baker murder, another situation where they know each other. It's clear in that case, based on browser history from the suspect's computer, that that this was premeditated. And so that was very, very instrumental, critical, if not critical, to the conviction in that case. 2009, the Craigslist killer, another homicide case, email that was transferred in that case, and the metadata associated with that email. Ultimately, he made a mistake, and that gave way to ultimately a prosecution in that case. 2014, Michelle Carter is alleged to have provoked Conrad Roy to commit suicide, is charged with involuntary manslaughter. Text messages in that particular case give way again in terms of digital evidence. 2016, Larry J. Thomas murder, and we see social media and user-generated content becoming kind of focal in that particular case as evidence. So stuff that's in the hands of a third party that was put up by an individual and not necessarily dependent on a local device or a forensic examination of a local device. 2016, Ross Compton commits arson. He's alleged to, he was convicted. We find out that in his particular case, his story doesn't sync with his medical device. So from the standpoint of what he told authorities and the data that was on his medical device, I believe it was a glucose meter, they were incompatible, and ultimately that became critical in this particular investigation. 2021, many of you watched this in glorious color, the Alex Murdaugh case. And the point that I bring this up, there are other cases, as mentioned by some of the other presenters today, that I could have gone after, but what I really wanted to deal with here is the point that this is just a tidal wave that's starting to break. So from the standpoint of the Murdaugh trial, cellular records, the suspect's cell phone was analyzed. There was vehicle forensics in that case. There was social media video collected based on legal process and entered into that case. They were all critical pieces of evidence in that case. Further, the investigators and the prosecutors in that case were criticized because of the following issues. The OnStar data was not recovered until well into the trial itself. So the location data from the vehicle that was relevant to the case came late in that sense, and was not necessarily as favorable as it should have been in terms of location of the vehicle, location of the suspect. The iPhone forensics, the wife's iPhone was found in a field. They found that based on cell provider, geolocation services. Ultimately, they recovered that phone. For one reason or another, they did not do a full analysis of that phone prior to the prosecution, which would have shown the condition of the phone, the state of the phone, who was using it, the timeline of applications and other processes that were running on that device. And so that iPhone exam was a very critical point in that trial. So you've seen us go from, wow, there's storage media with some metadata on it back in 2004, all the way through to just an absolute plethora of digital evidence sources. That may be well resulting from the fact that our behavior has changed. Human behavior has changed. We've allowed our lives to be saturated with digital reality. And those particular intrusions into our lives collect lots and lots of data in a way that we understand, and also in ways that we don't understand. And the field, from the standpoint of criminal investigators, prosecutors, are starting to become a lot more savvy about exactly what that means, and so is the defense bar. So as we kind of work our way through this, we see things here that are obvious. You know, cellular phones are with us all the time. They actually live with us in certain ways, and I'll talk more about that. There's high technology out there, things that we don't really think about. If you've got enhanced voice recognition in a vehicle that you're driving right now, would you be surprised to find out that I can go get browsing records from your car from AT&T? I mean, would that surprise you? From the perspective of high technology, as we make the world safer using technology, we also produce more data using technology. And ultimately that becomes potential evidence if it's acceptable and legal. So the Internet of Things, I'll talk a little bit more about as we go along here. That tends to have different meaning. That the compound term has different meaning to different people. I want to spend some time on that, and I certainly want to talk about wearable devices. How many folks have a wearable device on today? A watch? Everybody that's got a watch, put your hand up in the air. Okay, smart watches. How about rings? Anybody wearing a biometric ring? Is it an Aura? Awesome. Okay. There's probably 8 or 9 different brands that I found. I'm amazed at how the market's just exploding around that kind of technology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Anybody else wearing anything smart? This is for a door prize. Anything besides a watch or a ring that's actually smart that's out there. We'll get into this further, and I'm glad no one agreed to cooperate with that. So let's talk about wearable devices and phones. They tend to redefine us. We know where we are. We know what we've got to do. We're constant contact. We're communicating with people. So there's a broader sense of location, GPS. We use that GNSS network of satellites, that's up there over our heads all the time. We don't think much about it, but it fuels what we're able to do on the ground in more and more meaningful ways. Biometric information is something that from a medical death investigative perspective that I really want to spend more time on in this little presentation today. But I think that biometric information, sometimes we simplify, we trivialize it to mean certain kind of basic things that we're used to using. And we don't think about the full expanse of potential biometric information that's really there. Pervasive connections. Because I have a smartwatch on my arm, you might think, well, it's talking to his phone. Well, actually, my watch is talking to every one of you. And your phone is talking to my watch. Your phone's talking to my phone. From the perspective of whether we sync or connect, electronically is not really relevant. They still see each other. They have to be able to see each other in order to ultimately connect. And from the perspective of data transfer, we don't think about where that data goes and what it means. So right now, my iPhone in my bag behind me on the floor is essentially capturing MAC addresses for every other device in here that has Wi-Fi enabled. Okay. If your phone is on and you've got your Wi-Fi turned on, your MAC address is being written to system files on my iPhone. How long it'll stay there, we'll get to. But understand that in an electronic ecosystem, that has to happen for the system to function. Okay. And ultimately, the real question is, where is it and how long will it survive? All right. So now, this all redefines the crime scene. So from the perspective of the crime scene, if somebody is essentially shot in a vehicle out on 95 in Maryland this evening, and we know that there's a suspect vehicle, we got some video from the victim's car. The victim's car doesn't get a plate on the suspect vehicle. The suspect vehicle leaves the area. We basically go back to the cell carriers that we know based on the description of the vehicle that might have information on the suspect vehicle, but we really don't get anything meaningful back. Do we stop there? No. We go back to the phone company. We ask for engineering data. I want to know engineering data for that phone for the victim over the preceding 30 minutes to an hour. Maybe I see a provocation occur with regard to the engineering data, something in that cell record that gets me to a different location before the actual shooting occurs. And then ultimately, maybe I find video at that secondary location. This is an ecosystem that is just growing and layering and layering. And so as we kind of move through this, it's really important to understand how this technology. Now, in the case that I'm talking about, we ultimately wanted to know if there was a potential AirTag in the shooter's car, because I know that on the iPhone of the victim, that ultimately ultra wideband is seen by the victim's phone. Maybe that gets me to a unique descriptor that I can now file legal process on to get to a subscriber record that gives me a lead as to who the shooter is. Okay. This is not a far-fetched scenario. These are scenarios that are unfolding every day. Okay, so let's understand this from a couple of perspectives. One, the human reality of this all. So when I go to bed at night, forgive my slide, real estate management failed me here, but from the perspective of what I'm doing with my phone at night, it's charging. Is it charging next to me? It used to when I was younger. When I used to take those calls 24/7, I don't do that anymore. So it's charging in my office. So I'm different, but maybe I have an alarm set. Maybe I bring it with me in a hotel room. I want to wake up on time. So I'm using it. I'm using it in different ways that all make sense to us because we all do this with our devices. That's why we own them. That's how we use them. And then I understand that when I actually get up, I start to use the device differently. So I've got a perspective of interacting with this device when I'm awake, when I'm getting ready. What is the phone doing? What should I expect the state of the screen to be while I'm dressing and showering? Well, inactive, right? I mean, they're kind of normal things. From an investigative standpoint, from a forensic standpoint, this gets pretty important. Understanding what the routine was of the individual victim or the subject or the witness as it related to interaction with an electronic device. So we've got to be thinking about those things when we start analyzing digital evidence. We've also got to think about the network they're connecting to. So my phone, I just made a point earlier that I'm seeing your phones, potentially. I'm seeing your Bluetooth devices, potentially. There are BD addresses or the equivalent of a MAC address for Bluetooth devices. So for those of you that have Bluetooth devices that are essentially generating Bluetooth transmissions right now, my phone's also seeing those Bluetooth addresses. If they're public, that gets me somewhere. So there's all these network connections occurring before I ever try to connect to anything intentionally. That's all going on in the background. It's all out there. And we need to understand that that's all potentially leading to other sources of evidence that are out there and available to an investigation and a prosecution. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I'll say this a couple more times before I finish, how long that data survives, how long you have to get to it is another matter altogether. And it has to do very specifically with the device and the type of data we're talking about. So when we talk about physiological monitoring, there's some areas that we're really familiar with, and there's some areas that maybe we're not as familiar with. Sleep tracking doesn't work for me. I don't like things on my wrist at night. I can't deal with that. I can't leave my Fitbit or my smartwatch. It's too heavy. My hand goes to sleep. I end up waking up because I've got circulatory problems, carpal tunnel is aggravated, that kind of thing. You know what I mean? So not everybody does everything here that I've listed. But from the standpoint of what's normal, most of it's pretty normal for everybody. If you're somebody that has a sleep problem, then you're certainly doing something with a wearable device to try to track your sleep so you can get data to a physician, whether it's a medical device or whether it's just a fitness device. This is pretty normal stuff. Heart rate. My wife has AFib. I got one of those Tachycardia, the fingertip device peripherals for her phone. She's using that thing all the time. She's more worried about her AFib than she really needs to be, but it makes her comfortable to be able to see what's going on. This leads us to another point of order, and that is the accuracy of the data. We walked a bunch of records from those devices into her cardiologist's office not too long ago, and he said very clearly to her, interesting, none of this is AFib. Wait a minute, it says it's AFib. No, these are not AFib sine waves. From the standpoint of a cardiologist's experienced medical view of the data that she brought in. So what do you trust? Are these devices accurate? I mean, I've sat down with this watch on and taken my blood pressure and thought I was, going to be dead in the next 20 seconds. It has everything to do with the accuracy of the technology beyond the data itself, and that has to be clearly understood. There are lung capacity, devices and sensors. There are electrocardiogram capabilities built into multiple sensing devices in watches nowadays. So increasingly, the technology is trying to get more sophisticated. How accurate is it? I mean, that has to be understood before we use it. I've got a colleague who's a prosecutor right now who wears the glucose monitor on his arm. And right now, we're doing a study with a college at Purdue University, and he's basically pumping data through his normal glucose monitor through a different phone. We'll call it a burner for research sake. And they're taking that data back at Purdue University, and they're looking to see exactly where it's being written, exactly what they're getting, and exactly how accurate that data flow is back to the back end of the system. Okay, so what I put on here were the technical reality of some of these capabilities that we take for granted. You can see that I've got a heart rate monitor at the top. Most heart rate monitor is either infrared sensing or green light sensing, okay, through your wrist, your skin, some sort of biometric kind of touch point. But an accelerometer, how many people ever think about an accelerometer? I won't ask you why you're thinking about an accelerometer unless you're a runner. Are you a runner? Well, I mean, from my perspective, an accelerometer, is detecting changes in kinetic energy, speed, motion, etc. Not that many years ago, the Google Android device, the Google phone, was tested from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. And they took that phone and they put that phone in airplane mode. And they turned off location services on that phone. They drove it from DC up 95 to Philadelphia. When they got to Philadelphia, they connected it to a Wi-Fi access point, and they offloaded the data from that phone, and they sniffed, which is a network monitoring technology. So they looked at the packet flow off of that phone, and they were able to discern that that phone, while it was turned off and in a latent state, basically codified every cell tower up 95, knew exactly how fast it was moving the entire time it was traveling up 95, knew what configuration the phone was in while it was moving up 95. Okay, so there's a monstrous amount of data that's still in a device, even when we think it's not being collected because it's not connected to the cloud. It's not connected in the network. So what I'm trying to do here is to say, sometimes technology is passive, sometimes it's active. There still may be data. And from our perspective, from an investigative perspective, that's important. Gyroscope, barometers. Why do I care about a barometer? Well, if you live in New York City and you're an investigator there, you may want to know what floor the phone was on. You may want to know how high in the air that phone was. Did that phone actually make a significant increase barometrically or a decrease barometrically just before the victim was killed or just before the suspect's alibi comes into play? Does that tell us something about the context from an investigative standpoint? Sure it does. I mean, all that data becomes immediately very relevant. GPS, we lean on GPS very, very heavily, but what we fail to think a lot about is complementary or hybrid capabilities. Cellular technology, GPS, augmented cellular technology, and Wi-Fi. When we bundle at a handheld device level all three of those capabilities for geolocation, we have very accurate data with regard to a device and maybe an individual that the device was in the possession of. So we want to think about the bundling and merging of technologies. What I've given you here is a couple of snapshots of what a pulse oximeter looks like from the standpoint of monitoring blood flow. This is all LED based. Okay. I also put on there an electrodermal activity sensor, a picture of one of those devices. Why do we care about that? Well, some people care about how hot they get when they work out, or whether they're sweating profusely, or whether their skin has a certain amount of moisture to it. It could be used to generate indications of nervousness. Not that we're not going to poor man's polygraph. What we're talking about here is from a medical perspective, maybe somebody's monitoring that for a legitimate reason. They want to understand, their physical condition under different circumstances. And then there's your ECG sensor again down at the bottom. These are all becoming increasingly commonplace sensors to be embedded, not only in phones, but in much smaller devices. Quick story. I was on an airplane probably 7 years ago with an individual who worked for a particular company, and he was sitting next to me, and we were both in the exit row. We'd both gotten exit seats just before we took off from the airport. We had a relatively long flight. We were sitting next to each other. I asked him what he did for a living. He asked me what I did for a living. We were talking back and forth. He said, my company owns 5 or 6 patents that is essentially the emplacement of physiological sensors in clothing. Okay. And this is a while back. Now, of course, I didn't go buy any stock because I thought the SEC will find me. Okay. This is clearly going to be a poor ending in an insider trading case. But the fact of the matter is, so these types of issues, miniaturization, micro-sized sensors, we've been thinking about this for quite a while, and all this stuff is starting to come to market now. So having said that, Body worn devices are starting to show up in jewelry. We mentioned the ring, right? There are other types of jewelry in nature, form factor, devices out there that provide biometric capabilities in the way of sensors. Skin patches. It's so trivial nowadays to find RF-based skin patches that will monitor different things from a medical telehealth perspective, a medical monitoring perspective. It's out there. Does my victim have a history with those kinds of treatment patterns, that type of technology? Well, I mean, that's worth knowing. Underwear, undergarments, from the standpoint, I'm not 100% sure that I fully understand, other than discrete placement of sensors, why you go there. But from the standpoint, they're out there, they're for sale, okay, right now. Smart shoes, they've got a reputation for not working well. But from the perspective of why you would want to wear smart shoes, for people who are really adamant about running well, about pace and gait and how they step, how their stride works and whatnot, smart shoes tend to provide that kind of data backward into this type of an ecosystem. Headbands, helmets, that's everything from audio to the ability to monitor EEG inside of certain extreme sports. I want to monitor the EEG of an athlete. Okay. I don't know how accurate this is. A lot of these technologies are relatively new to me. I've certainly never used them. And from the standpoint of needing validation, they all need validation. They all need to be understood in terms of their ability to be accurate and credible. I've given you some visual identifiers here. You might recognize later on if you saw them. These are all biometric rings. They're all smart shoes or smart inserts. You don't need to buy the shoe. You can just buy a cushion, as an insert and put it inside of an existing shoe. This stuff is all out there. It's all available, and you can get to it now if you think that it's going to add value to your life and your quality of life. So here are some headbands. Here are patches, helmets. These are all smart technology driven examples that are in the marketplace today. They're out there, they're available today. And from the perspective of commonplace for a potential victim or a potential suspect, it's becoming more of a norm and would be easily understandable that we would find this in an investigation. Okay. So again, forgive my real estate management here, but what we want to talk about very quickly is in the course of a medical examiner's existence, a pathologist's existence, there are some major, kind of pieces to what happens in a medical death investigation. I've laid out, the scene itself. Well, guess what? I've made the point already. The scene has become larger. It's transient. It's potentially fluid. Okay, so from the notion of the old CSI approach to this one room, one body, one set of facts and evidence, witnesses, et cetera. That's not necessarily the case anymore. We may find ourselves in lots of different locations looking at different aspects, and they may not have physicality. That crime scene may just be digital. So I may need to go after a third party for very specific evidence in the course of generating legal process and getting it out there to obtain the evidence, to understand it, to be able to use it. And so the scene is taken on a completely different definition. The body examination. Well, what was on the body? What was with the body? What was in proximity to the body from the perspective of digital evidence? The thing that I wonder about when we talk about medical death investigations is when a medical examiner or pathologist is really kind of working through that part of body examination or reviewing what detectives have done or CSI specialists have done on scene, whether they're really thinking about the extent to which digital evidence might actually come into play. How much of it was there? How is it being documented? How is it being communicated between the investigators in the field and that medical examiner, who's working with the body ultimately in number 3, which is the autopsy or the postmortem examination. So does the electronic evidence help us with time of death? Does the electronic evidence, corroborate location where the body was prior to death? Antemortem considerations versus postmortem considerations. All of that digital evidence has potential weight and value in a medical death investigation, and it's something that we certainly should be thinking about as we're working through these issues. Evidence collection, during the autopsy. What happens if we get a body into a medical, a post-mortem environment, and we find additional digital evidence? Are we equipped to deal with that? What if we find an implanted RFID device, that's subcutaneous? How do we handle that particular piece of digital evidence in this day and age? Those types of technologies are out there and available, and for reasons I don't necessarily understand, but they're sold. People are buying them. People use them, for different tracking purposes. But from the standpoint of our ability to take that digital investigator out of the equation and then bring that body into an autopsy environment and then find additional digital evidence, how do we deal with that? How do we handle that digital evidence at that point? What's the proper way to deal with it? And so that kind of leads us right into the whole issue of evidence collection during the autopsy. Normally, that is typically biological, trace, the types of things that our other presenters have been talking about all day. What about increasingly the ability to find miniaturized or micro types of digital evidence with a victim and with that body? We don't have a swabbing technique for that type of evidence. There has to be a process for how to collect it, preserve it, and then actually make sure that it's going to be capable of being accessed and analyzed. So, does digital evidence affect documentation and reports? Well, to be fair, digital evidence reporting that I've seen over the years tends to be fairly lengthy, fairly focused. Typically, we want to talk about those steps I just mentioned a second ago, which was how do we identify it? How do we collect it? How do we preserve it? Exactly. How do we analyze it? And what was it that we found when we analyzed it? So how does that work in a medical death investigation? Is it a separate report? Is it a complementary segment or an appendix to a larger medical death investigative reporting and documentation process? How does that work in an agency? How does that work in a jurisdiction? To be fair, there aren't always, when I ask these questions, a lot of very clear-cut answers, because typically the responsibility for this is somewhat divided between the investigative agency, that medical examiner, that pathologist, and the prosecutor who's trying to kind of put it all together, at another point in this particular investigation. So personal information, how do I identify your Bluetooth device as being yours? Can a Bluetooth device that's on a victim's wrist actually identify the victim? Well, it'll identify somebody, assuming that it's in a condition that it can be preserved and analyzed properly, and we can deal with the company, the manufacturer, the data store on the back end of this particular device that has a subscriber account, that has some sort of information. Like I mentioned earlier, they all have unique identities from the standpoint of the technology itself, but it's going to get us, this technology will get us, we don't need a phone necessarily to identify me. If I pass out up here and it becomes a fatal scenario and I'm laying here on the ground and nobody knew who I was, my watch will identify me. You don't need my phone to identify me. There's enough data with regard to this watch to actually come up with sufficient PII to verify identity. Medical history. My watch probably tells you more about my medical history than even my phone does, because my watch is kind of a fire and forget phenomenon for me. I get up in the morning, it's charged, I put it on, I leave it on my wrist. Every once in a while, it sends me a notification. It talks to me about something my phone wants me to know, or it talks to me about something, that it has to say, such as the battery's getting low, something that's system relevant. But inside of this device, it's collecting biometric data, physiological data all day long. while I'm wearing it. So if I got into some sort of a rapid heart, condition while I was sitting during one of the presentations because I didn't necessarily agree with one of the presenters' points, there's a chance my watch will tell you that at the end of the day. The question is, again, where is the data? Is the data on the device? Was the data transmitted through a network? Doesn't have to be necessarily my phone. It could be a mesh network. Okay, there are plenty of mesh networks out there that allow for data to be transmitted in near proximity through other devices and on until they get to the cloud, to that greater backend network. But medical history is certainly a value proposition with regard to these devices. Circumstances of death. Sometimes the antemortem context gives us a reason to understand that a bit better. Sometimes it just sets the tone for the evidence that was found at the scene, and sometimes it sets a context for the autopsy itself. From the perspective of all the electronic data that I'm describing that's being collected, we've got a healthy amount of context nowadays for the average individual, which is being collected by these devices, either in tandem or individually. Okay. So the external examination of the body, I talked about that a little bit. We're looking for other evidence. We're looking for a reason to use data in a way that isn't maybe explained intuitively in the autopsy itself or the examination of the body. But from an internal examination perspective, that's an area where the jury's out for me. I'm not really sure, other than medical history itself, what the data does to help us with that examination, because I'm not a pathologist and I don't really understand the questions a pathologist has when a pathologist engages in that internal investigation. There's an awful lot of data about my health. For example, my phone probably tells you that I have had medications of certain types over the course of the last 3-4 weeks, maybe a month, because there's communications on that device that leads you to understand that. I've got a portal application on the device that you can actually see who my medical provider is. But when it comes right down to my condition today, does my watch say I'm dehydrated? Does my watch say I've got an elevated heart rate? Does my watch say something's going on that might actually help with that internal investigation? Possibly that data does help. That's not for me to decide. Now, all of these other areas, toxicology, we talked about that earlier. From the perspective of the amount of data that I collect in a digital sense nowadays, some of you would probably have very little trouble understanding how frequently I go to a liquor store, what I buy at the liquor store, and how quickly I'm replenishing what I got at the liquor store. So from the perspective of records that give us a cue into that environment, they may not be different than they were historically in terms of what they tell us. They're just more easily available. The transactions on whether I used Apple Pay or whether I used my credit card in some other format on my phone, all of that data is at our fingertips right away. So from the standpoint of healthcare apps, I mentioned my particular portal. I've been on my portal probably 4 or 5 times in the last couple of days. You know, why would I be on my medical portal? Well, I either needed treatment, I was waiting for some sort of response from my medical provider, or I was in there trying to make an appointment. I was having trouble doing it. You know, well, in my case, all 3 of those things were happening. Okay. So from the standpoint of what you get from that one single app on my device, you understand a lot about my medical situation and well-being very, very quickly. You know who the service provider is you're serving legal process to. You know where you're going to get much more detailed records, and you understand how I was invested in this healthcare process over the last several days prior to something happening. From the standpoint of capture technology, this is one of those things that's always fascinating me. When my son was in Iraq, he ended up in a situation in Iraq where there was a great deal of threat to his well-being. And it turned out later on, when he came back from Iraq in one piece, thank God, that he had video of what was going on from his phone in that situation. And my response as a father was, are you out of your mind? Why would you do that in that circumstance? What were you thinking about? Well, the truth of the matter is, if we think about how devices are used nowadays, that's probably the first thing that most people think about doing with their device in situations which are kind of high energy. They pull out their phone and they start filming. I mean, so from the perspective of capture devices right now, there's a pretty good chance that from the standpoint of that phone, that we're going to have some sort of media that helps us understand context, maybe even just a little bit. The mobile device data itself tells me where all this is happening. Where is this individual? What's the location of that device? It tells me what happened before this event unfolded, or this series of events unfolded, whether that was communications, whether that was maybe I was texting somebody during the course of a high energy event, or maybe it was right after the event concluded or culminated. Maybe I'm sending communications in. It's right there in one place altogether. That's why I said earlier on, it's very, very intrusive. That may not be traditional text messaging or phone calls. I think there's a very interesting phenomenon with regard to the age of different people and what they prefer to do with regard to communicating from a mobile device. I'm somebody who started out in the, you call me, call me, I was one of those, because that's my age, right? You can look at me and tell, he's definitely a telephone person. Then I found out that if I use text messages, I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to say, I have to say anything to you, anybody know who Simon Sinek is? Okay. So Sinek's an anthropologist, and he's very funny guy. And Simon Sinek likes to say that if you go to dinner and you set your cell phone on the table with the screen up, that you're not there for the people you're at dinner with, you're there for the cell phone. Okay. And he said, now turn the phone upside down so the screen's down, and try to make them believe that you're still not there for the phone. You're still there for the phone. You just want them to believe that you're there for them. Okay. He captures kind of the reality of this relationship we have with these devices. The data and the investigative value should follow that line of thought. We need to think about that relationship and how it works out. Now, I was offended because my wife would have pictures of our grandchildren and I had not seen them. And I would say to my wife, where did they come from? And she said, well, I got them from your son or your daughter. And I said, your son, your daughter, they didn't send me these pictures. What's going on here? I'm a little hurt, and she'd say, well, we're on Instagram. I'm not going on Instagram. I don't use Instagram. Well, that's where we're talking. We got a little group message on Instagram, and everybody's sharing pictures of the grandkids and what they did yesterday, today, the next day, and whatnot. So they forced me to go to Instagram. And now I'm on Instagram, and I'll be in the middle of a meeting like this, and I'm trying to respond to, one of my grandkids, because that's where everybody comes together. So we have evolved from the phone to the text to the email. None of the other stuff went away. It's all there still. We still have to use that for work or for different relationships where that's appropriate. But we have moved to that social media reality where it's just user-generated content. And to be fair, if I don't have something to say to my son, I send him something funny. I think it's funny. And if he laughs at me, then I think, okay, I did my dad job today. I relieve some of his stress, and it's all good. He's a federal agent, so I try to keep him light and airy and whatnot. Okay. So, connected vehicles, IoT. I started to talk about the vehicles. This is a whole nother area. We try to kind of lump vehicles and IoT together. The truth of the matter is vehicles are becoming incredibly connected, not just the telematics, aspects of the vehicles, but from the standpoint of how they interact with my smartwatch. I get into my truck sees my smartwatch. I get into my truck knows my phone. Do you want to use our infotainment system to your phone? So all of these systems are becoming that extended ecosystem I was talking about earlier. From the perspective of vehicles themselves, they're talking all the time. Some people don't really stop to think about that. Your vehicle is talking to a cell carrier all the time. Since a certain date and time, there are at least 2 cell phone radios in every vehicle that's been produced, with some exceptions in terms of manufacturers. One for the manufacturer, one for you. Just because you don't have an OnStar subscription doesn't mean that the modem in that car is not talking to the mothership. Okay. They're talking all the time. That's the way they're designed. I can tell you that based on testing we have done, the SIMs, they could be electronic SIMs that are chips, or they could be regular style SIMs we put into phones, old fashioned, old school. But the SIMs are actually configured when that vehicle is manufactured at the factory. We have seen vehicles with live SIMs come out of the factory all the way to the dealership. Okay. So from the standpoint of the manufacturer, that cell phone modem's live when that car is born. Okay. Just to understand how early the efficacy of that data might be. Okay. So it's, I'm going to give you a solid 5 minutes for questions. And I'm going to cover a few topics here at the end that I promised I would, that I think are probably some of the meat of what I had to say. A lot of this is, be aware, understand, let's smile about certain phenomenon. But the truth of the matter is that in the Internet of Things, in the vehicle technology, the connected vehicle technology realm, in the marriage between wearables and your phones, research is being done in a very fragmented way. I listed a couple of institutions up here that are funded by DOJ right now that are doing research. We have a relationship with Champlain and also with Purdue University. I mentioned Purdue earlier. Champlain was doing a lot of work on regular household kind of IoT devices. Well, what do you mean? What were they doing? Well, I mean, I told Joe earlier today that I got into their lab last week and they had a Roomba, up on one of the benches. And I said, what's the Roomba for? I mean, that's probably pretty sophisticated firmware. What are you guys doing with a Roomba? And I said, what's your use case? Did the Roomba murder that cat that I saw on Instagram riding on top of it? And that was my little joke. And they said, no, it's not funny. This is serious. This is serious stuff. These devices are mapping rooms, right? We don't think about the fact that our phones now have LiDAR in some cases. If you've got a newer version phone, Apple's given you LiDAR, which is a location and mapping technology. So if you've got the 3 lenses on the back, there you go. Okay, so what you should understand about LiDAR is that when you use that device, LiDAR is mapping the room. It's mapping everything in the room in proximity. So if I took my phone and I started doing panoramic around this room here, it would actually measure the distance between you all in the room. Okay, so what does that mean? If somebody took a shot of a room that I care about in an investigative sense, there's something called a depth map that the LiDAR data resides in behind that photo data that will actually give you verifiable distance and perspective between the objects that are in that room, to include evidence. Okay, why did Apple build that capability into a cell phone? Because ultimately they want you to put on a pair of Oculus goggles and they want you to use your phone to map your entire house, so you can now bring your gaming reality into your house and then play that game in your living room, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, that you can use those spaces and not have to go somewhere else to map. I mean, that was maybe the business intent, but there's evidence there. There's real evidence there. Okay, so Champlain's looking at that kind of stuff. They're looking at Nest and Ring doorbells and how much data is on the device versus what gets sent to the cloud. They're studying all that stuff. John Jay's looking at a whole host of other IoT devices right now. This is another BJA funded grant activity that's going on there. Marshall University did a lot of work with vehicles. Okay, here's the problem. The problem is that it's a little bit here, a little bit there, it's a little bit here, it's a little bit there. If you're an investigator or prosecutor and you want an answer to a very specific question, you've got to know who did what work and you got to go ask them for an answer. It's not aggregated. And I think that's probably what BJA will look at next, is aggregating all that data so that we've got it all in one place. Not to mention the fact that the market's changing day in and day out. The technology is changing day in, day out. So this goes on the historical list. And then we've got a whole new landscape of technology to go after with regard to research. All right. Quality management. a term that was talked about in a lot of different ways already today. One of the things that I did want to mention about quality management in the digital realm is that the Scientific Working Group for Digital Evidence is now a standards development organization for the OSAC. They are sending standards directly to the registry, brand new, hot off the presses. Okay, the OSAC has approved them as an SSO, and from the standpoint of what the SWGDE is doing is they're trying to actually speed up the ability to get relevant references and standards in the OSAC registry. So there's also a movement to try to create US standards for digital, for MDE, with regard, just like an ANSI standard or an ASTM standard, but from the perspective of something that would be originated from the SWGDE. So stay tuned. This is all just kind of starting right now and moving forward. And I've got great hope that we're going to refine what we're doing with quality management around digital in a way that we've just not had before. Because applying 17025 or 17020 to digital forensics has been very, very difficult. NIST did a study with the OSAC, one of their technical working groups, and they determined in that study that what was happening from a quality management standpoint was they were layering certain overhead on top of these organizations because of how fast the rapidity of change in these labs was, how they had to react to new tools, new technology, update, et cetera, that it was not achieving for prosecutors and investigators in the courtroom the requisite results they desire. So now they're trying to figure out, okay, well, if that's not working well enough, what do we need to do? So one of the alternative paths is to create tailored standards for quality management as it relates to digital multimedia and digital evidence. So a lot of embedded local systems versus networks in these discussions right now. And what I mean by that is we understand the device as much as we can, as much as we're willing to be intrusive, to rip the device apart, to basically take a chip off the board and actually dump the blob that's on that chip into an environment, take it apart, decode it, understand what's on it, try to get assistance from the manufacturer if we can. But from the standpoint of embedded local systems, we need to pay equal time to the back end because there's money in the back end with regard to that service subscription. And so the data is never going to be absent the back end. So we've got to be prepared for legal process. The device may help us. The device gets us to the back end. We need to be understanding what's in the back end and how to talk to it in terms of legal process. Proprietary firmware and software has always been a challenge. That requires a certain amount of reverse engineering on the research end of things. And I said already a couple of times, the product landscape is increasing very, very rapidly. And so that adds to the challenge. So the focus has been mobile. Honestly, has been mobile. You talk to people in digital forensic units in major cities, and they'll tell you phone, laptop. Oh, this must be big. Okay, because a lot of what they're doing is mobile device based, not as much about these types of devices. So this is new. This is an emergent topic. The thing that I was telling Joe earlier was these devices, Purdue has determined that these devices send data to what's called a write-ahead log. Why? Because it allows for continuity of communication and data exchange between the two. Okay. Now that write-ahead log is difficult to get to from the standpoint of what kind of access you need to have at the cell phone level. The data is sitting on the mobile device. There's a lot of it there. It's quite astounding. I didn't bring it all to show you today because I only had an hour to talk to you. But from the perspective of what I would like you to understand is when you understand, somebody tells you that I can actually get you an entire GPS map for the last 5 days from this person's phone. The very next question from you should be, how long before it spoils? Okay. How long, some of that data I talked about earlier about Wi-Fi connections and Bluetooth connections, you see me, you write down that you saw me, but we never really connect. How long does that data stick around? Because it's only good if you can get to it, right? So at the end of the day, understand that there's spoliation built into some of these gems, of data. And so the last thing I just want to leave you with is the whole connected vehicle thing. the vehicle industry is exploding in terms of capability. The next version of the automobile, the electronics on board. Years and years ago, I'm retired military. So years ago, we had a vehicle, 4 wheels, and that was the primary asset. And then you put a radio in it, and that was an accessory. And then about 10 years later, the radio was the primary asset, and it just happened to have 4 wheels under it. Okay. Cars have done the same thing. I mean, they've honestly done the same thing, and we're missing that. We drive them, we use them. I mean, think about the fact that, you know, some person with less than perfect judgment decided to get in their Tesla and just get in the back seat and let the Tesla take them home. Okay. Have you seen that video where a CHP officer actually, you know, finds the Tesla driving up I-5 and there's nobody behind the wheel? The owner's drunk and in the back seat. Okay. The Tesla's driving him to his house, and the CHP officer very, very discreetly pulls around in front of the Tesla and then slowly starts to brake. Well, the car is smart, right? The car brakes too. Ultimately, the CHP officer stops, the Tesla stops, everything's good, right? He's banging on the window, trying to get the guy to open the car and whatnot. I'm still trying to figure out who taught the CHP officer how to stop the Tesla, because that was the most impressive thing that I saw in the video. Okay. At the end of the day, we have to deal with this convergence, this tidal wave of technology. And there's a lot of value to the medical death investigation in discrete ways that we may not think about. So dig deeply into the technology. When somebody shows you something new, ask them, what else does it do? And how does it how does it make my day? Questions for anybody that has no concern about that steak that's waiting for them across the street.
So you cover all the stuff on your devices and your phone. Is that all encrypted, or can you have? I guess it's 2 bucks. You have to have the actual device to get the information, or can you get it from like the manufacturer?
So typically, I'm going to use terminology that you may or may not you may well understand. Forgive me, but you need a physical extraction of the device. Okay, so you need everything. You need the system data as well. Okay, not just logical data that's on the phone. The second thing you have to have is you have to have the ability to root the device. So what I mean by that is, if it's an iPhone, you've got to jailbreak. You've got to get to a jailbreak type level where you can actually see what Apple tried to protect. Okay, so a lot of that data is in a configuration where, to answer your encryption question, Apple tried to fence it off in an encrypted sense, but at a point it's accessible, and the researchers have proven that it's easily accessible with the right approach, the right attack.
So when you talk about these devices talking to each other, is all that getting stored somewhere off of these devices as well?
That is a great question. So in the illustration I used about the guy who gets shot in the car by the other driver in the other car, when you have an iPhone, and essentially there's an alternative to jailbreaking an iPhone, which we refer to as, you put it in sysdiagnose mode. Okay, so you've got to move this operating system into the iOS operating system into a configuration where you have like developer access into that system. We were hopeful that there's a series of files that are .trace files. Okay, so they capture all this data. We were hopeful that in those .trace files that we would have unique data that would allow us to generate legal process on something that was in that other car. You know, something that would uniquely identify that other car. You may think, well, okay, that's a lot of work, you know, for a maybe, because maybe has to do with how old are we at, how much time's gone by before we've asked the question. I mean, there are nuances around the iOS operating system that, you know, at 30 days, you start losing data unless it's on a gray key device, which kind of stops the clock. But my point back to answer your question is, I think the manufacturers of these devices are trying to encrypt that data. There are ultimately ways to get beyond that in many cases, as we've kind of described here. And then the last thing I would say is, I was teaching prosecutors in North Carolina, a digital evidence basic boot camp. And one of the prosecutors said, my lab at the state level says they can't do chip off, you know, on an iPhone. And I said, what do you mean they can't do chip off? And he said, yeah, they say on an iPhone they can't do chip off. And I said, okay, let's save this for the break and then we'll talk about it. What the prosecutor was really trying to tell me was that the lab was telling the prosecutor that after a certain version of iPhone, there was no point in doing chip off because the blob on the chip is encrypted and we're not going to get anywhere with it anyway. So why destroy the phone just to get an encrypted blob out of that chip? Sometimes the devil's in the detail in terms of who's protecting at what level.
So Apple doesn't have all the information on their own servers because they want that data, don't they? Or they just have generalized data, not specifics, like they know that you're a guy, you're a woman, you're in New York, you're in California.
I want to say this in a way that is cautious. Remember San Bernardino, and the FBI asked Apple to open the phone, and what was their response? No. So from the standpoint of answering your question right now, it may have everything to do with the manufacturer's position on whether the data exists. So we may be asking a question here with regard to data that in their data dictionary, we don't really understand what they call it. You know, we can see it, it's encoded, but we don't really know how to phrase that properly for Apple's lawyers in legal process. And so it takes a village to figure the answer out in those cases, I think. Yeah. And to be fair, I think law enforcement does an amazing job of trying to kind of inform each other and say, I did this, they said no. I did that, they said no. And then all of a sudden, I did this, I got a response, you know, and then it's slowly but surely. But I mean, I've heard people refer to that as say the magic word. I think it has to do with the fact, in all honesty, to Apple, they've got a government elite relations organization in their company. They're taking request after request after request. And so if you send something through the door that they can't really effectively answer, they push it off, you know, to the side and send you back whatever the, you know, Johnny's showing what's behind door number 3. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you were mentioning about the accelerometer function being on airplane.
If I'm completely mislabeled you, I'm very sorry.
So my question is, we've got somebody who's driving an old clunker that doesn't have a computer. Can you use, or has that been used to reconstruct information about a motor vehicle collision?
Well, so that's kind of a fascinating question. I like the fact that you asked that because I'm a guy who wants a classic pickup truck tomorrow morning, and not necessarily for the reason you mentioned, but I'm probably going to take my iPhone with me in that truck. And so my iPhone is going to tell that accident reconstructionist everything that the car would have. So yes, you're right. Yeah. Even how fast I brake, you know, at some level of, again, you have to be careful with accuracy in terms of what the device was designed to do versus what you're trying to get out of it from an evidentiary standpoint. Yes, sir.
Is there a way for AirTags, you mentioned AirTags earlier, to figure out if who owns the AirTag?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Well, who owns the AirTag in legal terms is what Apple ID registered the AirTag. Is to be clear. So from the standpoint of the AirTag has a form factor on the outside that comes apart. If you have the physical AirTag, there's a serial number written inside. You just pull the plastic off and you can read the serial number. Then you can go back to Apple with legal process and they will tell you which Apple ID, and then you can obviously request subscriber information on that Apple ID. If you didn't actually physically recover the AirTag and you have a victim, and the victim got an alert through the Apple Find My network, that alert will also tell the victim what the serial number of that lurking AirTag is, and you want the victim to take a screenshot of that information. When that Find My alert comes through, take a screenshot of that information and then provide it to the investigator, so the investigator can then do the same thing and go back to Apple. Anybody else? I hope you have the most magnificent meals tonight. Great conversation. Thank you for paying attention.